Well, hello, good afternoon, and welcome to episode 93 of Humanity versus Insanity, the Crane Report. It's also election special number 5, and it will be the last in this series of election specials, unless, of course, Theresa May, over the weekend, calls another election. Well, I'm not sure it's going to happen necessarily this weekend, but I think it's a pretty fair bet that the country will be once again at the polls, either before year end or certainly within the next 12 months. And I know a number of people are expecting me to be euphoric after this result. And forgive me if I'm not euphoric, because there is no result that was really ideal in this election, because it is simply about buying time. But one phenomenal benefit of this election is it has politicized the masses in a way that we haven't seen for many, many years, perhaps even since the 1960s. Now, whether this political interest, I won't necessarily say awareness, but whether this interest can be sustained, of course, remains to be seen. But it would be remiss of me not to have a quick run through and look at how the media are responding to this shock result. Well, the only people that can be shocked are those that were actually out of touch with the feeling or the pulse of the country. So let's have a quick run through. This was the Daily Telegraph. Shock for May as exit polls point to hung Parliament. Well, we know that the Prime Minister is always protected from the rigours and the scrutiny of the media, and it is carefully screened to make sure that they don't go into meltdown from the magnitude of the negative press. But nonetheless, so although it's a shock to very few people outside of probably the Tory inner sanctum, nonetheless, it's probably true to say it was a shock to Theresa May. The Guardian also saying the exit poll shock. So I think, it was very evident right from the get-go, from the first announcement of the exit polls last night, that there was not going to be a Tory majority. So let's have a look at the Times and the Financial Times. May's poll nightmare. May's gamble backfires as voters reject bid for stronger mandate. Well, clearly, once again, supposedly the poll suggested that she had this mythical 20-point lead. Well, maybe amongst her sycophants. But, again, as I mentioned yesterday, it's interesting to note that many of the polls, the phone polls, are conducted using landlines. And landlines are a dying technology. Very, very few people who are mobile today or effectively looking to reduce their utilities outlays, very few people maintaining landlines for anything other than perhaps the router, preferring instead to rely on their mobile phone. So, that demographic maybe did present the prospect of a May victory, but it wasn't representative of the country. The Daily Express, May's fight to stay in power. And, of course, she is going to hang on in there for dear life until such time as she reaches her Maggie moment, where effectively she's hung out to dry by those she thought she could trust, because there's no such thing as loyalty, of course, in politics. And then the shock exit poll leaves Britain hanging. Well, it wasn't the exit poll that left them hanging, it was the actual poll. And, of course, the worst headline from yesterday was this by Murdoch's rag, The Sun. And, there was some speculation late last night that The Sun might actually try to recover some integrity by running this as its front page today. And instead of denigrating Corbyn for his untried policies, but denigrating Theresa May for her dementia tax, the privatisation of the NHS, selling arms to Saudis, running through a cornfield, which, of course, she claimed was the naughtiest thing she'd ever done. Scrapping human rights, well, hopefully now she won't have the mandate to pursue that one. Legalise fox hunting. Well, I don't think that was ever really going to get off the ground again. Cut police funding, nuclear holocaust. Obviously, she can't debate her own policies, and an uncosted manifesto. Well, as we have expressed over the last few days, then the Tories have increased the national debt by 70%, adding 700 billion to the national debt since they came to office in 2010. Well, the Sun, Murdoch, elected not to run with that front page, and the early editions of the paper ran with this, Theresa Dismay, but then it was amended so that later editions ran with this, Mayhem. And as I suggested yesterday, this is very, very significant because I think this election, this 2017 election, absolutely underlines the end of the Murdoch media influence in British politics. And apparently, rumour has it that he absolutely stormed out of a press party last night. I think it was hosted by The Times. But he stormed out of the party once the exit polls were released. And of course, this is the first time in 40 plus years, probably since 1974, I think, first time that Murdoch has failed to influence the outcome of the general election. And as I've shown, the phenomenal fall in readership of the Sun and the Daily Mail over the last 7 years, their combined readership barely being what the Sun was achieving itself alone in 2010. So these two national dailies with a circulation of over 5 million in 2010 now barely have 3 million between them. So this is very, very interesting. And as we know, it's also proven that those people who get their information online tend not to get it from a single source. So that's one of the reasons that I do read the Sun and the Mail, because that way, if I hear people re-quote, then I know instantaneously that they base their worldview purely on what Paul Dacker or Rupert Murdoch are projecting as the establishment narrative. But those people who seek to get their information online get it from multiple sources. They tend to have a much better in-depth understanding of what's occurring and are more able to articulate the reason they hold a particular view compared to those who buy the lamestream rags. And I predict that by 2022, which is in theory the next election, although I think that we might see one somewhat sooner, but that the influence of these daily newspapers will have diminished very significantly. But of course that brings about the threat that the politicians, and particularly the right wing, although I'm not ignoring the left either here, will want to put further controls on the internet as they realise that the political output no longer carries the influence in the public narrative. Well, let's have a quick look, because there are some interesting things that come out of this election. And this is the map. This is actually from the BBC website. But what you see here, it shouldn't be too surprising. And that is that the bulk of the country, because the bulk of the country is relatively rural. And the rural communities still buy in to the Tory narrative. And generally, of course, this is a relatively wealthy demographic, particularly those who are in their latter years. It's perhaps the last generation that owns their own property outright in many cases, and actually has an income, i.e. from a company pension plan, plus, of course, their state pension. So they have a considerable degree of independence, and many of them are also benefiting from remaining on their former employers' private healthcare plans. But it's the city areas, it is the urban areas. Up here in Tyneside, here in this is Tyneside, this is Berwick, Tyneside, and then right across the Liverpool and Manchester area and South Wales. So, and we'll have a look at this in a second, because the fact that it is urban areas that are primarily the Labour support base is going to be very interesting over the next few years. But let's have a look at the numbers. This is not quite the final numbers. I think there's another one, at least one seat to be announced. I think that's in Cornwall, so that'll probably be Tory. But the Conservatives managed to achieve 318 seats, which actually I think is better than they thought at probably about 1 o'clock in the morning. And that's a loss of 12 seats. So although they had a very, very narrow majority before the election, now of course they don't have one at all. The turnout was actually higher, and they actually managed to get 13.6 million votes. But to put that in perspective, that is only 800,000, in fact, slightly under 800,000 votes more than Labour. Labour polling 40% of the vote. And frankly, I mean, we always stated that this was very much a two-horse race. And never has that been more evident. And until such time as this country considers and starts moving towards a system of proportional representation, sadly, it's going to become probably even more polarised over the coming years. But let's have a look at that urban phenomena of the Labour stronghold. Now, this is an interesting one because what we're seeing here, this is London. And what we're seeing is that with the exception of south-west London, right through Middlesex, right round into North London, up into South Hertfordshire here, over into Essex and Kent, it's Labour. Now, I anticipate that also that we're going to see a change here as London goes through the gentrification programme. Go to Merseyside. And interestingly, the entire Wirral is now a Labour stronghold, along with North Wales. And then we have the belt here, the old industrial belt, right across from Liverpool, right across to Manchester and over into South Yorkshire, all Labour strongholds. And then this is the M65 belt. So this is Blackburn, Burnley, and over into Skipton. In West Yorkshire here. Now, interestingly, in the Fylde here, and this particular constituency is of particular interest because, of course, this is the prime target for the unconventional gas industry, i.e. fracking, and this is where Quadrilla are currently in the process of drilling the first of the wells since the moratorium was lifted almost 5 years ago now. So although Lancaster and Fleetwood remained Labour and Blackpool South remained Labour, the Fylde itself, the Fylde Peninsula, is Tory. And Mark Menzies, who we've discussed a number of times on Fracking Nightmare, so I'm not going to go into the detail of his somewhat checkered history right now, but Mark Menzies is returned with 27,000 votes. So this is nearly 8,000 votes more than his nearest challenger, Jed Sullivan. And the reality is it wouldn't have mattered if every other candidate had stood down, because Mark Menzies still had sufficient margin so that he got more than 50% of the total votes. So, yeah, interesting that Menzies gets re-elected. And, of course, the Tory government, such as it is going to claim that the vote in the Fylde, and we'll look at North Yorkshire in a second, is effectively a mandate for the unconventional gas industry to get underway in these areas. But what I would say is that it is absolutely imperative that people in these constituencies get the statistics on postal votes, because we are already hearing of some irregularities in constituencies regarding postal votes. And it's important that perhaps we get a picture this time on where postal votes might have been used to manipulate the result. Now, I'm not suggesting that Mark Menzies would not have won in the field anyway. I mean, this is a dyed-in-the-wool Tory seat. But consider the possibility that his majority was artificially hyped to create this impression of a massive mandate for the unconventional gas industry in that area. Then across the other side, the Pennines, although we have Teesside and Tyneside here, traditional Labour strongholds, but North Yorkshire and particularly Thirsk and Moreton, very much Tory strongholds. And Kevin Hollinsnake, who is the MP who was put in place in 2015 to replace Anne McIntosh, because Anne McIntosh had expressed her vehement opposition to fracking in the constituency. So she was a bit of an embarrassment to the Tory government. So she was elevated to the Lords, where of course she can do no damage whatsoever, but still be nicely rewarded for her trouble. So Kevin Hollinrake getting well over 50% of the vote here, and getting 33,000 votes. I think it's nearly 60% of the total votes cast, actually. So once again, no doubt the Tories and the lone pro-fracker in North Yorkshire will be waxing lyrical about how this is a mandate. So likewise, I encourage freedom of information requests, or maybe phone Kevin Hollinsnake's office and ask for the information directly on the numbers of postal votes or percentage of postal votes that contributed to his remarkable victory here. Now, yesterday, I suggested that Theresa May would be unlikely to survive this election, and I think that risk is much greater now than it was even yesterday. And I made the observation that this particular individual, Amber Rudd, was being groomed to be her successor. And we played a short video clip of her effectively shutting down the independent Nicholas Wilson at the hustings in Hastings, because he was exposing the relationship between the Tory government, Saudi Arabia, and the arms sales to Saudi Arabia, and the disassociation that the Tory government was placing on the Saudi role in terror, and of course her claims that, you know, basically she was doing everything she could to keep Britain safe whilst pumping phenomenal amount of arms into a highly volatile region. Well, Amber Rudd had a pretty rough night, and in fact, after 5 recounts, she apparently won the Hastings and Rye constituency by a grand total of just 346 votes. Now, I'm not sure why, if there's 346 difference, why it should take 5 recounts. So, you know, once again, was there perhaps a ballot box that magically appeared out of nowhere to give her this differential? Or was it perhaps postal votes? So once again, I implore people within the Hastings and Rye constituency to seek clarification on why it was necessary to have 5 recounts and the role of postal votes in the outcome of her victory there. Well, the reality is I don't think she is any longer a candidate for the leadership of the Tory party, because there is no way the party can run the risk of putting somebody with such a narrow majority in the leadership role, because that would be the double embarrassment of them actually losing their seat potentially in the next election later this year. Well, Craig Murray absolutely nails Amber Rudd on his website. Craig Murray, of course, is a former British diplomat who had the audacity to expose the torture regime in Uzbekistan, where he was posted as Britain's ambassador. But because Uzbekistan was part of the potential revolutions to bring about regime change in that part of the world, and so he was targeted by the establishment. In fact, he was accused of having a mental breakdown and was recalled to London, and yet everything that he basically stated at that time has proven, of course, to be absolutely true. So Craig is certainly a critic of the establishment that is worth monitoring. And this article is from his website, so just Google Craig Murray. Amber Rudd really is that horrible. And the opening paragraph, a multi-millionairess like all the Tory elite, Amber Rudd truly is every bit as horrible as the persona she exhibited on the BBC Leaders Debate this evening. A former banker with JP Morgan, she was also a director of 2 offshore tax avoidance asset management firms in the Bahamas. She never declared this, and the information came out in a leak. The refined journalists of the Financial Times are, of course, much more her choice for public engagement than having to stoop to discuss policy in front of the great unwashed, for whom she has a profound contempt. This is what she thinks of her constituents in Hastings, and she's quoted as saying, "You get people who are on benefits, who prefer to be on benefits by the seaside. They're not moving down here to get a job, they're moving down here to have easy access to friends and drugs and drink." Well, that's what she thinks of her constituency. So I don't think that Amber Rudd is any longer a viable candidate for the for the Conservative Freudian slip leadership. Is there any difference? Maybe not. Well, so who is the candidate? Well, I know there are those who think that Boris is back in the frame. And that's maybe what the establishment want. Maybe they do want a liability. And, over the last few days, I've taken some flack from the, the right-wing leaning members of the alternative community for my overt support for Jeremy Corbyn. But what I say to these people is, really, do you have no concept of strategy? There is not going to be a quick fix. One of the biggest problems that we have in this country is political apathy. It's the inability, the lack of motivation or lack of desire for people to actually engage in the political arena, but be more comfortable just to moan and whinge about it from the comfort of their living room on their keyboard. Well, we actually have to get involved. And there is quite probably some justification for the suggestion that this whole sorry election was manipulated to deliberately bring about a breakdown of the Brexit discussions. And I'm going to share with you a comment that I think is quite insightful. And this appeared on the Mail Online earlier this morning. So let me just read this out to you. How convenient. Just the result the establishment needed. It didn't require any fuss or vote to force the UK further into a United States of Europe against our will. The majority was completely ignored for 2 decades, and even today we are still ignored after a successful referendum. The Tories promised, I should say threatened more accurately, during the election to immediately proceed with Brexit if we voted to leave. But we still voted to leave. Cameron resigned as a delaying tactic, and they've been delaying ever since. Delaying to try and tip the balance of the population through the open door to guarantee that Brexit is halted. The British people are put on an irreversible path to becoming a minority, and the British people pass into history. Nobody believes anymore, if they've got an ounce of common sense, that what has happened has been a bloody accident when the democratic will of the British people has been ignored for decades. Now consider that everything that is observed in that letter is actually true. And there's a very, very good possibility of that, because we know very well that the establishment does not want the UK out of Europe. But that is what the people of the UK voted for. And as we've discussed many times over the past 12 months on Humanity versus Insanity, the evidence would suggest that the figures in the referendum were massaged so that it deliberately looked like it was a close call. Yet, polls, more accurate, more demanding polls that were taken over a longer period prior to the Brexit vote suggest that the real vote for getting out of Europe was in the region of 70%. Not 51%, but 70%, or maybe even greater. But that has to be played down because that is too strong a will of the people. So the reason that it has been allowed to be delayed, to be obfuscated, is because the British people have done what they always do after an election. They go back to their lives. And this, of course, is what politicians want. They don't want you to get involved. They want you to put your X in the box, and then they want you to disappear, to leave them alone, to not encumber them with your problems or the wider problems that you're aware of in the country or in the geopolitical arena. They just want you to go away. And that's why they are desperate to try and create a completely depoliticized society. Well, just maybe this is what has backfired on them. And it's really, really important that people engage in the process, not just from their computers, although obviously we do appreciate those people that maybe don't have the ability or the resources to actually get out and hit the streets. But people need to engage in the process. Otherwise, the author of this letter has probably hit the nail on the head, and they'll just wait until the British people are absolutely in the minority, the Coudenhove-Kalergi agenda, to flood Northern Europe with immigrants, to break down the national homogeneity of those countries, to create nation states that are a minority within their own nation state. Much easier to control. An agenda spelt out by Count Richard Coudenhove-Kalergi way back in the 1920s in his book Pan-Europa. It's all there for people to see. And we've discussed this on past episodes of Humanity vs. Insanity. So please, review those episodes and take a look at how this agenda is being foisted upon us. And of course, this is the company that absolutely needs to be under scrutiny. This is IDOX. This is the company that is responsible for administering the postal vote system. So if there are any irregularities, then it's IDOX that need to be challenged. And of course, Peter Lilly's relationship with IDOX certainly needs to be put under the spotlight. Well, I must confess that I did have a little punt yesterday, and I put two small bets on, just £10 each. One bet being that there would be no overall majority. I got 9-2 on that. And the other bet was £10 on Jeremy Corbyn being Prime Minister before the end of the year. And that one, I think, is still a possibility. So here's the message. The reason that the Tories lost the vote was because after 7 years, they had effectively destroyed what was left of the social fabric of this country, targeting the less able, targeting the disabled, targeting the elderly, targeting the sick, targeting the NHS, reducing benefits, increasingly making employment in the country less stable by forcing people into 0 or minimal hours contracts. So it really should be no surprise that the Tories lost their majority. And in fact, some might argue we're surprised they didn't lose even more seats. Will the number of people using food banks over nearly 1.2 million was the last number that we had from the Trussell Trust over the 12 months to April 2017. 1.2 million people in this country needing emergency 3-day food packs to be able to survive. I'm no socialist. I am a social capitalist. And if that is a contradiction of terms, then I make no apology. Because my definition of capitalism is capitalism with a social conscience. Capitalism that recognizes that it is right to nurture, to stimulate, to motivate people's ability and to reward that ability, not to the outrageous degree of the corporatist mentality, but to give people due reward in an environment that also takes account of the fact that there are people within society who are less able, who are less fortunate, who are elderly, who have made their contribution to society and need to be supported. So What's happened over the last 24 hours is not the definitive result. And there is no question, if we all sit back, then we are still going to drift into a dystopian nightmare. Either a right-wing nightmare or a left-wing nightmare, but either way, it's a communitarian nightmare. And the only way in which that is abated is if the people who are already starting the process of the political awakening actually get involved. And it's wonderful to see so many young people getting involved, even if it was motivated by the prospect of education without having to pay fees. And neither should they have to pay fees. That's part of the social conscience. Now the challenge is to nurture that new political awareness and use that to bring about the changes that we all know we need to see. So this isn't the end. It's not even the beginning of the end. It's a stage in the process. And what happens beyond this point is not dependent on politicians. It's dependent on whether the people, who the politicians are beginning to realize do have something to say about their agenda, it's whether those people can now step up to the plate en masse to help bring about the changes we all know we need to see. So this is the end of the 5 days of election specials. And I have to say, I have tremendous renewed respect for the guys here at UK Column, because I know how much effort I put into putting these 5 daily episodes together, and these guys are doing it every day, every week, throughout the year. So if you are not tuning in on a regular basis to the UK Column News, which goes out live at 1 o'clock on the www.ukcolumn.org/live, then I'd encourage you to do so, because that is an excellent source of information. I'm now heading back to the north of England, where I will be back on the Kirby Misperton Protection Camp next week. Now, I do understand that the camp has taken quite a battering in the storms during the week. So if you're in the area around North Yorkshire, and you can lend a hand to help with the rebuilding over the course of the weekend, then please make your way to Kirby Misperton, and you will be made very welcome indeed. I'll be back there on Tuesday, and the anti-fracking campaign carries on here, because Theresa May has still got, not a majority, but she's got the opportunity at the moment at least to stay in number 10 and still continue with her unconventional gas, i.e. fracking agenda. So more than ever, there are the needs for the people to get their boots on the ground. People from right across the north of England and from the East Midlands and from Cheshire, in all those targeted areas, get yourselves to Preston New Road, get involved and get some experience and see what is coming to your area unless you stop it. I'll see you in a couple of weeks with the next episode of Humanity versus Insanity, unless Theresa May calls another election in the meantime.